Thank you so much for that warm welcome. What a beautiful day, what a fabulous event, and happy summer solstice. Well, I'm an ecology teacher. I teach at a little private school up in Northern California called New College of California. I might say a few words more about that later on. I'm not a petroleum geologist. I don't even play one on TV. And yet I wrote a book on oil and the future of petroleum. So I want to start out just by telling you a little story about how that happened. And I realize some of you in this audience probably know a little bit about this topic already. So what I'm going to do is spend about the first 20 minutes of my talk acquainting those of you who don't know about peak oil with what it's all about, and then hopefully offer some recent information that I've been following as a result of recent travels in Europe and conversations with some very knowledgeable people in the oil industry, for those of you who are already acquainted with the subject. So first, my story. I've been interested in human societies and how they mutate for a long time. Why did we go from being hunter-gatherers to planting and domesticating food crops? I even wrote a couple of books on the subject, and the word energy doesn't even appear in the index. That's how clueless I was to the role of energy in human societies. Now, in the late 1980s, when that last piece of information fell into place, it was as though the biggest light bulb in the world went off. And I realized that energy is really everything. It's everything in ecosystems. It's all, why do animals eat? It's to get energy. Why do we eat? It's in order to get energy. And why do human societies change over time? Well, it's because they have either depleted a source of energy and are searching for a new one, or because they've found a different source of energy. Well, the title of my book, The Party's Over, has to do with the biggest party in the history of the planet, and that is the party of industrial society. We, for a long time, have found marginal ways of increasing our energy extraction from the environment through agriculture and through windmills and water mills and so on, which we were doing throughout the Middle Ages. But when we discovered fossil fuels, it was as though we had won the energy jumbo lottery. I mean, here was stuff that nature had put underground for us hundreds of millions of years ago, and carefully and slowly concentrated until it was the most energy-dense, wonderful source of power that you could imagine. And all we have to do is stick in a straw, draw it off, and look at what we can do. One gauge of what we can do is the fact that our human population on this planet never exceeded a few 100 million souls. Throughout all of the millennia, tens of thousands of years that we've lived on this planet. Actually, when we were hunters and gatherers, the number of human beings on the planet probably never exceeded, 10, 50, maybe 100 million at the most. With agriculture, we were able to bump that up to maybe 500 million, 600 million. By 1800, we had gotten almost up to 1 billion. Okay, that's only 200 years ago. And over the last 200 years, with first coal and then oil and natural gas, we've been able to increase the human population on this planet almost 7-fold. That's extraordinary. I mean, just since we passed the 6 billion mark in 1999. Now, that wasn't that long ago. I can kind of remember 1999 vaguely, Yeah. So just since 1999, we have added another 400 million people. Now, what's the population of North America? Pretty close to 400 million people. So we've added basically another North America just since 1999. Now, do you think we've added a North America's worth of resources? Have we added a North America's worth of support infrastructure? Of course not. But that's some kind of gauge of the pace at which we are adding human population to this planet. And how are we doing that? Well, if it weren't for fossil fuels, it would be damn hard. Now, how do fossil fuels figure into this? Well, of course, there are factors like superior sanitation, cutting down on disease, better medical care. All of that feeds into it. But when you come right down to it, look at a place like the Arizona desert. How many people can the Arizona desert support? Well, depends. Without fossil fuels, a few hundred. With fossil fuels, hey, you could build a city of 2.5 million there if you wanted to. And of course, it's been done. It's called Phoenix. We use fossil fuels to transport resources from where they're abundant to where they're scarce. And we use fossil fuels to speed up and enlarge the extraction of resources and the transformation of those resources into manufactured goods that support life. So we have increased the human load on the planet dramatically, and we've increased our numbers dramatically. This is success. This is the biggest party in history. Now, unfortunately, this party is based on non-renewable resources, which means at some point that party is going to wind down. So knowing when that point that's pretty important information. Now, a clue to that is provided by recent history. We live in the United States, the center of the oil empire. The US is where the first commercial oil well was drilled in 1859. Very soon after that, a clever young man by the name of John D. Rockefeller realized that there were a few bucks to be made from this stuff. And he created the world's first multinational corporation, Standard Oil, and became the world's wealthiest man. The problem then was the stuff was so cheap and so abundant, nobody really knew what to do with it. The reason the whole thing got started, by the way, is important to realize, because we started using oil because we were already depleting other resources, namely whale oil. We were using whale oil as fuel to light, to illuminate our houses. And we were starting to hunt and kill all the whales, so whale oil was getting more expensive. We needed something else to light our houses with. Somebody, a fellow by the name of Colonel Drake, had the crazy idea of drilling a well for oil, just like you drill a well for water. And of course, he was successful. As I said a moment ago, the problem was that there was really more oil available than was actually needed for lighting houses. So Rockefeller got to work funding research on how to use this stuff for other purposes. And of course, other people were working on the problem too. And by the end of the 19th century, it was realized that you could use oil to heat houses as well, to run steamships. The internal combustion engine had been invented. The automobile had been invented. A few years later, the airplane was invented. And the US, because it was the center of the oil industry, also became the center of the automobile industry and the aircraft industry. The US became what petroleum geologists call the first mature oil-producing province. More oil wells were drilled in the lower 48 US than the rest of the world put together. This is where the oil business started. This is where we've had the most experience with oil. So the story of the US is very significant. And that story is that oil discoveries started in 1859 and they increased dramatically until about 1930. And after the discoveries in East Texas, they kind of leveled off and began to go downhill to the point where now really there's virtually no new oil being discovered in the lower 48 US. Nobody's looking for it because it costs more to discover a new oil well than the oil in the well is worth. It's just not happening. That's what geologists mean when they say this is a mature oil-producing province. Okay, so oil discovery peaked around 1930. Then, around 1970, 71, oil production peaked, or as I prefer to say, oil extraction, as though we're actually producing oil. You know, all we're doing is taking it out of the ground. Okay, so it kind of makes sense, you know, you can't extract something that you haven't first discovered. So there was this 40-year lag between oil discovery peak and oil production peak. And ever since about 1970, 71, US oil production has been going downhill. Now, this is, I think, the most important economic event in US history. That's a big statement, but I think it's pretty easy to back up. Ever since 1970, everything has been different in this country. I was born in 1950. In 1950, the US was the world's foremost oil-producing nation. We were also the world's foremost creditor nation. We were loaning money to the rest of the world, and we were self-sufficient in virtually all important resources. Okay, fast forward to 2004, we are the world's foremost oil importing nation. We're the world's foremost debtor nation. We are in debt to the rest of the world as no other country in history has ever been. And we are dependent on the rest of the world for manufactured goods and all kinds of other resources. Now, is this the result of poor management? Well, sure, partly. I mean, we've had some terrible political decisions and management along the way, but fundamentally, it's simply the result of the depletion of the resources which made this country the world's wealthiest and most powerful nation in human history. So, if this is the experience of the US, it stands to reason that as other oil-producing regions become mature, they will have a similar experience as well. And that's exactly what has happened and what is happening with country after country. Global oil discovery peaked in the early 1960s. That means that prior to 1960s, we were discovering more and more supergiant oil fields year after year. Since the early 1960s, less and less, to the point that last year, in 2003, was the first year since the early 1920s when virtually no new giant wells were discovered. Up until about 1980, we were discovering more new oil every year than we were using. Since 1980, we've been using more oil every year than we're discovering. And currently, we're discovering about 1 barrel of oil for every 4 or 5 that we pull out of the ground and use. Now, it doesn't take a mathematical genius to know that that's a process that can't go on forever. So the question is, when will global peak occur? Now, this is not the question that most politicians and economists ask. They ask the question, when will the oil run out? And that's the wrong question. Intuitively, that seems natural, right? When we think of oil, we use the metaphor of the gas tank in our car. All right? We fill up the gas tank and it gradually runs out. And, well, the Earth's gas tank was full when we started and it's gradually running out, so the metaphor should work, right? Well, the difference is your car runs just fine on a full tank or a half tank or a quarter tank or a 1/16 of a tank. You can still go 60 miles an hour or 80 miles an hour on a 1/16 of a tank. It's only when you get to the last drops that you notice that there's a problem and the car just stops. Okay? Well, oil in the ground doesn't work that way. It's not in a big tank underground. It's in shallow, snaky reservoirs in all kinds of different places and in porous rocks. So, and it's of different qualities. So naturally, petroleum geologists go after the cheap, easy stuff, the stuff that's easy to find, easy to extract in nice, hospitable places first, and save the hard, nasty, poorer quality, more expensive stuff for later. Well, the news is that we've pretty much run through the cheap, easy stuff. There's still lots of oil in the ground. There are tons and tons of hydrocarbon molecules in the ground just waiting to be discovered, extracted, and so on. But they are hydrocarbon molecules in a form and in places that makes it a much more expensive and difficult proposition to get them out of the ground and into your gas tank. So if somebody asks, well, when will the oil run out? Well, the economist scratches his head and says, well, everybody agrees there's at least 1 trillion barrels of oil in the ground, and we're using 80 million barrels a day, so get out the calculator, do a little simple math. Well, that's 40 years worth of oil. So we don't have to worry for 40 years, right? It makes sense if you're thinking in a very superficial way, which apparently most economists and politicians do. But if you're thinking about the real world, then we have a problem on our hands. Let's look at the real world situation here. I said everybody pretty much agrees there's at least 1 trillion barrels of oil in the ground. Well, where is that oil? And what are the consequences of getting it out of the ground? I said earlier that the U.S. oil production peak in 1970 was a watershed event, the most important economic event of U.S. history. Again, let's go back to that. Let's look what happened after that. 1973, only 2 or 3 years after U.S. production peak, the first oil shock. Oil prices went up 400% almost overnight. Now, that wouldn't have happened if the U.S. had still been self-sufficient in oil. It was because of the U.S. oil production peak and increasing U.S. dependency on imports that we were vulnerable to the oil shock. Then in 1979, with the fall of the Shah of Iran, the Iran hostage crisis, oil prices again go up another 200%. They double on top of what had already happened in '73. Jimmy Carter puts forward what would come to be known as the Carter Doctrine, which says that henceforth, the oil supplies of the Middle East are of strategic importance to the United States, and we will use our military to defend our access to those oil supplies halfway around the world. Are you starting to see why this is such an important event for the U.S.? Everything has changed. Because we're dependent now on the oil of the Middle East, all of our resources, our military resources, our political resources are centered now on that part of the world. Meanwhile, there are pretty deep questions as to just how much oil actually is still there. Maybe you've noticed gas prices have kind of gone up a little bit in the last few months. What's the problem? What's the cause of that? Well, people talk about, well, we've maxed out our refining capacity in the US, which is true. But essentially, there's very, very little spare export capacity anywhere in the world at this point. And this is a sign that we're probably coming up very close to that global oil production peak. In my book, I said it would likely occur sometime between 2006 and 2016. The signs that we're seeing now globally suggest that the earlier date is much more likely than the later date. Saudi Arabia. Everyone agrees Saudi Arabia probably has the world's largest proven reserves, but to what extent? And how can Saudi Arabia actually increase its exports? See, having the reserves is one thing. Being able to increase the rate of extraction and therefore the rate of exports, that's a separate question. So Saudi Arabia, again, lots of hydrocarbon molecules there, but where do they stand in relation to their ability to increase their exports? There's an interesting guy named Matthew Simmons, who's an oil investment banker. If you're interested in the subject, I highly recommend you check out his website, SimmonsInternational.com. He's studied oil and gas globally about as carefully as anybody I know. By the way, he was on the Cheney Energy Task Force. Considers himself a lifelong Republican. Very interesting guy. I've met him and I enjoy talking to him. He's it's kind of a eerie experience, but but he's a fine person, and he's studied these geologist reports, about 200 of them, going back for the last 20 years on the Saudi oil wells, and he is deeply worried. Now, here's a man who is connected to the oil industry in every possible way. His office is in Houston, Texas. And I already told you other things about his background. For him to say that Saudi Arabia may be peaking right now, that's pretty significant. I was just talking to him about 3 weeks ago in Berlin, Germany, where we were gathered at the meeting of the Association for the Study of Peak Oil. It's a organization mostly made up of European scientists. And all kinds of European press there, because the word is getting out about peak oil and the importance of this subject. So there were, BBC was there, and the Italian and French and German media, and so on. There was only one U.S. media representative there, a woman from Dow Jones Newswire. That was it. There were 10 people from North America at the conference out of 300. There were European members of the European Union Parliament members, German Parliament members, French Parliament members, British. And the subject of discussion there was, okay, just how close are we? Now, ASPO publishes a yearly summary of oil production and oil reserve figures. And for 2002, 2003, their scenario was for a global peak around 2015. As of 2004, they have pushed back their projected global peak date to 2007. So the word is leaking out, and this is evidence for this is in this month's National Geographic, The End of Cheap Oil. I recommend, if you don't have this issue of National Geographic, you get it. It's a good article, certainly not perfect. Of course, they have to balance their story. So they'll they'll have a paragraph about Colin Campbell, who's one of the real oil experts, former oil executive and petroleum geologist, who's probably the most knowledgeable person about the subject of oil depletion. And then they have to balance him by talking to some economist who, sees that we have 40 years left before there's anything to worry about. But nevertheless, the fact that the subject is on the cover of this month's National Geographic tells us something. When I wrote my book, The Party's Over, the subject was nowhere. You mentioned peak oil and nobody even knew what you were talking about. The subject is starting to get into people's minds. And as that happens, people start worrying, as well they should. Because what's our plan? There's every evidence to suggest that the current administration knows what's going on. Dick Cheney gave a speech in 1999 in London to the Petroleum Institute, in which, at that time, remember, he was working as the CEO of Halliburton, the world's foremost oil services company. And in his speech, he said, currently, we're projecting a 2% annual increase in demand for oil. Meanwhile, there is a natural 3% depletion rate in existing reserves. That means that by 2010, we will have to replace something like 6 out of 10 barrels of oil in production today with new sources. Now, anybody who's in the industry knows that that's going to be a tough job. Where are we going to find that 6 out of 10 new barrels of oil? Are there just whole new Saudi Arabias out there ready to be discovered? If there are, the exploration geologists would like to know where they are. Please, come forward and tell us, because the whole world has been pretty much explored by now using satellite 3D imagery. So this was basically a statement saying we're in trouble. The CIA knows about peak oil. I have classified CIA documents dating back to the mid-1970s that have been recently declassified as a result of Freedom of Information Act requests, which show that already in the mid-1970s, only a few years after the US oil production peak, the world's first, already the CIA was carefully watching not only oil production, but also the phenomenon of depletion and oil peaking in different countries, and they were projecting when the Soviet Union would peak, so that they could use that information to undermine the Soviet economy. And in fact, they did, and that's part of the reason that the Soviet system failed in 1989. So they have this information. What are they doing with it? Well, Dick Cheney says, the American way of life is non-negotiable. So what that means is, we're not going to tell you, the people, what's actually going on, because that would disrupt things. It would disrupt the economy. It would disrupt the oil industry. It would cause waves. We don't want to do that. What we would rather do is simply use our immense military power to go to the other side of the world, commandeer the resources, and use them till they're gone. Good plan, huh? It's a little more complicated than that, but that's what it boils down to. Now, do I think that the occupation of Iraq is about oil? Absolutely. Now, is it about simply, running a pipeline from Basra to Houston and sucking Iraq's oil out of the ground so that it can go directly into American gas tanks? No, it is more complex than that. And maybe I can say a few words about oil geopolitics for a minute, because I think this is a very, very serious subject. Essentially, we are in a war right now for the future of industrial society. As much as I disagree with the invasion and occupation of Iraq, it is being undertaken for very serious purposes. I don't think $187 billion would have been spent, and hundreds of American lives and tens of thousands of Iraqi lives would have been spent up to this moment if something very serious were not at stake. Essentially what that is control of the region, political control of the region. And I'm not talking about Iraq, I'm talking mostly about Saudi Arabia. What we're seeing right now with the assassinations of various foreign workers in Saudi Arabia is kind of the canary in the mine shaft, the tip of the iceberg, use the metaphor of your choice. So there's a very deep tectonic shift going on in the Middle East right now. And it has to do with who is going to control these remaining resources as the global oil peak approaches and passes. The U.S. wants to maintain that control, and if we seek to do that through military means, what we are looking at is literally, exactly as we have been told, war for the remainder of our lifetime. And it will be ultimately a no-holds-barred war. The nuclear weapons that we have in our arsenal are not there for decoration. They're there for deterrence, but in the kind of battles that we are looking forward to, deterrence means nothing. Saudi Arabia is becoming destabilized systematically, and over the next few months, regardless of whether Saudi Arabia faces a geological oil production peak, we may see oil exports from Saudi Arabia cut off for political reasons. That, I think, will likely signal a profound escalation in the conflict, and other powers will likely come in as time goes on. And the situation long term is extremely dangerous and dire, because we have the possibility of resource wars on several different levels. First of all, between rich and powerful oil importing countries on one hand and militarily weak oil exporting countries. So on one hand, countries like the US or China or Russia, Europe, and on the other hand, countries like those in the Middle East, West Africa, Nigeria, Venezuela. Then the possibility of resource wars between oil importing countries, increasing conflict and geopolitical rivalry between the US and China, between the US and old Europe, the US and Russia. And in fact, Russia and France and Germany are increasingly strategically aligned because they see Eurasia as being a natural geopolitical fulcrum in the world to counterbalance US hegemony. Meanwhile, the US is economically perched on the brink of collapse because of the level of US debt, domestic and especially foreign debt, and the US balance of trade deficit, which is extraordinary. The only way the US is able to maintain this level of debt is because our currency happens to be the hegemonic global currency. In other words, if you are Japan and you want to import oil from Saudi Arabia, you have to pay for it in US dollars. You can't pay for it in yen, you can't pay for it in euros. What this does is that it gives the US dollar an artificially high value, and it enables the US to import oil at artificially low prices. Now, you wonder, why is Europe paying $5 a gallon while we're paying $2 a gallon for gasoline? It partly has to do with the fact that they have higher gasoline taxes, but it also partly has to do with the fact that the US dollar is used universally to pay for oil imports. And of course, the law of supply and demand works here. If the US dollar is in demand because everybody needs it, then it becomes worth more. And other currencies are devalued against it. Well, that situation may soon change. The rest of the world is, well, I should say, many countries in the world are becoming a little disillusioned with dollar hegemony because of the rate of US debt. They're seeing the dollar as being less and less of a good investment opportunity, and the euro as being perhaps a better bet long run. Now, if significant oil-producing countries, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and others, begin to sell their oil for other currencies besides the US dollar, this could have a catastrophic effect on the US economy. These are the kinds of considerations that are going on behind the scenes that make the folks in Washington so insistent on pursuing this otherwise incomprehensible war in the Middle East, right? They know that the US economy is at stake. Our very way of life is at stake. Well, what are the alternatives, we might ask? I mean, if plan A is war for the remainder of our lifetimes, isn't there some other possibility? Well, the fact of the matter is, long term, our way of life is going to change sooner or later. It may be 20 years from now, or it might be tomorrow. So, what if we were to undertake that change voluntarily? What if, instead of fighting for the last drop in the Middle East, or Venezuela, or Nigeria, or wherever the next battleground is going to be, what if we undertook a transition within our economy to conservation and the use of renewable energy sources? Somehow I thought you might like that idea. Okay, I do too. I have solar panels on the roof of my house. I drive my car on modified vegetable oil. Great, good idea. And it's not simple. We have gotten ourselves into a situation of such tremendous, overwhelming dependency on fossil fuels that the transition is going to require some hard work and some sacrifice, and it's going to take some time. The last person to suggest that level of sacrifice was a guy named Jimmy Carter, who didn't last very long. Nobody wants to be the next Jimmy Carter. Now, back where I come from in Northern California, our representative is a woman named Lynn Woolsey. She's very far to the left of the political spectrum, as far to the left of the political spectrum as you can get in the US Congress, let's put it that way. I've talked several times with Lynn Woolsey and given her my PowerPoint presentation on peak oil, and she gets it. I've even given public presentations on the same stage with Lynn, and you know, I do the peak oil show, and she does the, you know, why the Bush energy plan is bad show, and we work together. Fabulous. And I asked her, Lynn, well, why can't you talk about peak oil? Well, this is a subject no American politician can talk about, she says. Interesting. I mentioned earlier, Matt Simmons was on the Cheney Energy Task Force. He can call up Dick Cheney and talk to him on the phone. And I say to Matt Simmons, well, you know, can't you, I mean, what's the deal? What does Dick Cheney say? And he says, well, no American politician can talk about peak oil. We've gotten ourselves into a Dickens of a situation here. I believe that Americans would be willing to undertake the kind of sacrifices and effort that are in fact required if they understood the situation and the consequences of the path that we're on now. But in order for that to happen, first we have to understand. The word has to get out. Now there are some impediments to that. Again, the oil industry and the economists, the people who say, well, we have 40 years of oil and no problem. Saudi Arabia can continue increasing its exports for the next 50 years. And all of those sorts of fairy tales. Well, that message is becoming thinner and thinner. The credibility of that message is being undermined with every passing day as we see, for example, the Russian oil minister saying, as he did 2 weeks ago, I'm sorry, Russia can't increase its oil exports anymore. Or when, just a couple of months ago, as gas prices were going through the roof, OPEC agreed to increase its oil exports, by 2 million barrels a day. Fine, OPEC to the rescue. But just a few days ago, OPEC said, well, we're going to have trouble doing that. Could all of you non-OPEC countries please increase your exports? The jig is up. It's very clear that global oil production peak is not 10, 20, 40 years down the line. It is staring us in the face. Now, if this phenomenon happens, this tectonic phenomenon happens, and we don't understand that it's not those evil people in the Middle East who are subjecting us to it, but that it's a simple geological phenomenon of the depletion of the resource that we've become dependent on. If we don't understand that, can you see how easily we can be manipulated into supporting war after war after war? The only thing that is going to short-circuit that is that if we understand and if we demand our leaders to wake up, start accepting and putting forward the truth of the matter that we have to change our way of life. The American way of life may not be negotiable in Dick Cheney's terms, but ultimately, nature does not negotiate. So, I want to close by saying a word in support of prophets of doom. This is a tough one. I hear occasionally from people who say, we've heard enough doom and gloom. It just depresses everyone. It ruins people's day. What we need are just examples of hopeful, visionary alternatives for the future, and that's what we need. Well, I would say yes, and we need both. And why is that? Well, we're in a situation that's not unique, fundamentally. Every species confronts the fundamental ecological dilemma that we are confronting right now, which is basically population pressure, resource depletion, and habitat destruction. This is nothing new. Every human society has faced this from the dawn of time. And most species, when they confront the universal ecological dilemma, respond by dying off. Most civilizations, when they have confronted the universal ecological dilemma, most civilizations have responded by collapsing. Now, what's different about us? Well, we like to hold ourselves forward as being like really intelligent people. We're not just another species that runs on the basis of instinct. We have an intellect. And that allows us to understand our situation in scientific terms and to project forward the consequences of our actions. Now, this is very important. This is what makes us different from yeast. about it. I like to talk about yeast because I'm from Northern California, wine country, right? And if, you have a nice vat of grape juice, and you add some yeast, and the sugar in the grape juice is like the ultimate resource for the yeast. And so they go to town using up this resource, and their population blooms. But as they're using up the resource, they're also poisoning themselves with their own effluent, which is alcohol, which is, in our minds, the whole point of the exercise. And the yeast die off. Okay, now the question is, are human beings smarter than yeast? This is the problem that we're confronting. Now, okay, so the role of the prophet of doom, right, we're only going to prove that we're smarter than yeast if we can, in fact, project forward the consequences of our actions and act on that information. Okay?
Very good.
So here I am, Jeremiah. My role is prophet of doom. I've given you some information. That information needs to get out. Our only hope is if a larger and larger percentage of the American population is alerted to the fact of what's going on, understands it intellectually, and is willing to take some action on that basis. So I am charging you with the task of going forth and telling your friends, your family, what's up. And there are lots of resources available on the internet, my book, other books. There have been 2 other books since mine was published on the same subject, very good books. So there's no lack of information. Even just this article in the current National Geographic should be enough to get past the skeptic in your family or at your office. What are we doing here? We have a few minutes for questions, if you're willing to stand up and shout them out. Thank you so much for the opportunity to bring this message to you. Thank you so much. Now, I'm genuinely interested in hearing what you have to say or what you have to ask, so please stand up and yell out. Yes, sir.
Back during the Arab oil embargo, I was very active in promoting ethanol, grain alcohol, as an alternative to gasoline. And I'm still doing it, but I see that there's a big interest in vegetable oil. And back in the 80s, we went through a lot of misinformation that was being put out by the petroleum industry about alcohol that will destroy your engine and so forth. And it's like nobody even talks about it. And it's not going to solve our needs. It might solve 10% of our needs, but it's something we can do.
Right. Yeah, biofuels, ethanol and biodiesel are inevitably going to be niche fuels. They can't solve the whole problem. We just don't have enough farmland. Nevertheless, we should be using what alternatives we do currently have available. Of course, higher efficiency in the automotive fleet would be the ideal thing, and that could be done literally with a stroke of a pen. And the fact that our politicians have avoided requiring greater fuel efficiency from the U.S. fleet is the shame of our country. Yes.
Are there any seminars that will follow up on that chapter?
Yeah, there's a transportation seminar that will be taking place at 2 o'clock. So if you're interested in transportation, maybe just one more question. There in the back. Yeah.
Whoever takes, if the Saudi Arabian government falls, someone else takes over, aren't they going to have to, develop their resources themselves, oil? Does it really matter, who is sitting on top of that oil in Saudi Arabia?
Does it really matter who is sitting on top of the Saudi oil? Well, from the standpoint of the geostrategists, it matters a great deal because who is going to get the preferential contracts? Will it be France? Will it be Germany? Will it be China? China is increasing its oil imports at the rate of about 30% a year right now. We all have this nice image of a billion Chinese riding bicycles, but recently bicycles were banned from the streets of Shanghai because the Chinese are buying automobiles at such a furious pace. So China is increasingly a competitor for Saudi Arabian oil. So whoever has the power to let contracts for oil is going to be in a position of tremendous power and influence in the Middle East. And of course, we want our people in that position. So it's a big problem. I'm informed that that's all the time that we have for questions. I'm sorry that that's the case, but I do appreciate your attention and your interest in this subject. More power to you.